Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this panel on Russia-Ukraine war. My name is Sergei Radchenko. I'm the Wilson E. Schmidt Professor at SAIS Europe. We have been hosting here a conference on how wars end, a closed conference where we looked at history of warfare. But we also have an open element. We have some of the best experts who are here today to talk about this subject, and I will hand over to my good friend Shashank Joshi, who's the defense editor at The Economist, who will basically moderate this panel. I think, Shashank, you will also introduce all the other panelists and take it from here. So thank you all for coming. I'm looking forward to interesting discussion.
Great, thank you very much. Thank you, Sergey. Thanks for hosting us here. Pleasure to join you all. For those of us joining virtually, we have a small, select but a highly expert audience here in person. And for those of you here, we also have a lot of people joining us virtually. So there'll be opportunities for questions virtually and from the floor, so please think of those as we speak. As Sergey said, we've had a really enriching couple of days thinking very hard about war termination. How do wars end? And we've been thinking and debating and discussing with the help of really world-class experts on their respective subjects, cases as diverse as the First World War, Vietnam, Korea, the Soviet-Afghan War, the Yugoslav wars, trying to think through the theory and practice of how these were concluded by the participants, by the belligerents, and the journey they were on, how difficult that was, what it took to end these conflicts, the various obstacles. And I'm going to ask all the panelists to keep that in the back of their minds as they offer their remarks. I'm going to prompt all of them briefly to offer an opening set of remarks, hopefully around 5 minutes in response to what I ask them. But I really hope we drill back down to the question that we've been tasked with on this panel, which is the Russia-Ukraine war, an end in sight. So a historically informed approach that helps us get an answer to that question or closer to that question. One of the things that certainly has struck me from the last 2 days is the critical importance, when you're looking at how wars end, of what one participant reminded us was the importance of converging expectations, the expectations on both sides of the conflict converging on what they expect they can get from fighting and what they can expect they get from talking, and how that changes over time, and how new information revealed on the battlefield or revealed in other ways changes their assessments, changes their opinions in ways that affects the conflict. And that's really significant. And therefore, the place to begin, I think, has to be a military assessment. And to that, I'm going to turn to Michael Kofman of the Carnegie Institute, the Carnegie Endowment, who I think we all know very well as one of the world's foremost Russia military experts, to give us a sense of where we are on the battlefield, but with a particular view, Mike, to how expectations are changing of what is possible militarily. We've just had a year in which a Ukrainian counteroffensive is not done terribly successfully. Ukraine is on the back foot. There are also suggestions Russia's defense industrial complex may run into more troubles next year. So expectations are in flux. But what I'd like to hear from you, as well as an assessment of where we are now, is does Ukraine have a realistic offensive option? And when will that turn up, to the best of your ability to tell us? So Mike, take it away.
Sure, thanks, Shashank. Appreciate starting off with such an easy question. And good to be here. Thanks to Johns Hopkins SAIS Bologna for putting this together. So maybe briefly, I think where we are right now in the war is that although Russia holds much of the strategic initiative and has material advantages, they've not yet so far proven decisive, in the sense that the Russian military still struggles to achieve a decisive breakthrough. But this year is going to be a year where we're going to be looking for this information to alter, first, our assumptions, because when you're analyzing a war, you're always working with a set of assumptions. Second, you're often informed by what has happened in the war, which is useful, but that's not necessarily how the war is going to proceed, right? Wars don't necessarily end the way they begin. They tend to unfold in phases. And so you often can fall into the fallacy of extrapolating from wherever it is you are in the war and thinking that's how it's going to go. And lastly, wars get into these phases of reconstitution, attrition. So one of the biggest questions we have right now is if you think of last year was Ukraine's principal window of opportunity. This year ends up being Russia's window of opportunity. And the big question right now is, can Ukraine hold Russia to fairly incremental gains at the relative peak of Russian defense spending? If Russia's unable to establish a decisive advantage, if they're not able to generate momentum, and the next 3 months will be very challenging. I mean, I have a deep sense that things are likely to get worse before they get better. The supplemental that's passed is very important, but the main things that it does is it buys time, it creates potentially the opportunity to reconstitute the Ukrainian military, and it provides certainty over the kind of funding that's available and what you have to work with for at least another year in the war. Much depends on what we and Ukrainians end up doing with it, right? What we actually use it for. So, if we fast forward, it is possible this year that Ukraine effectively holds, is able to expand a strike campaign. This is an optimistic scenario, is able to expand a strike campaign as well against Russian territory and against critical infrastructure with some kind of economic significance in Russia. And this is sort of the long pole in the tent to challenge, over a longer period of time is able to rebuild its military, rebuild its offensive potential to at least pose the threat of an offensive operation of some kind next year. One thing that we should leave for discussion on this panel is whether Ukraine actually necessarily needs another successful major offensive next year in order to achieve war termination on favorable terms. Is that a requirement, right? What does Ukraine actually need to be able to achieve by next year? If Ukraine is able to hold Russia this year, that already will put it in a substantially better position than the way the year began and the situation that Ukraine is currently in. That's what we say might call necessary but not sufficient. Lastly, on Russia. So while Russian military has these advantages, it also has significant constraints. And I won't get into those details, but the Russian material advantage does not keep increasing from 2024 into 2025. Actually, the Russian advantage relative to Russian goals and the Ukrainian ability to mount a defense is very likely to begin decreasing as we get into next year. That's why I mentioned this year as sort of a window of opportunity for the Russian military. And so far, while they've been slowly creeping and making incremental gains, they've not been able to achieve these larger strategic breakthroughs. So maybe I should stop there. Hope I answered at least a part of your question.
Yeah, I'm going to follow up before I just move on, though, which is to ask, from a purely military perspective, even if the relative military balance in combat power between Russia and Ukraine stops widening next year for whatever reason, how do you look at the sustainability of Russia's military in this? Are there critical bottlenecks, choke points, constraints, or can they continue feeding people old stocks, new weapons into this fight for many, many years to come, sufficient to keep Ukraine on the back foot?
So I think from a money and financing perspective, certainly as far as one can see, maybe for at least another year or two, Russia's likely to be able to sustain the war. Money is not, from my point, going to be the principal constraint in the near term. From a people perspective, that is also very much the case. Russia last year was contracting at maybe upwards of 30,000 men per month. This year, maybe a bit less than that, although we have to be frank about uncertainties on those numbers. But they are able to replace losses and regenerate combat power at a sustained rate based on contracting without the need for mobilization. The main constraint that Russia has is when it comes to equipment. Russia's been burning through equipment at a very high rate. To conduct offensive operations, they've been using up equipment in phase of sizable amounts. The bulk of the equipment being used by the Russian military is taken out of storage. It is the Soviet inheritance and legacy that the Russian military is burning through. A small percentage of it is replaced by what the defense industrial complex can make, but here they have very significant constraints. Because of that, as we get into 2025, they're going to have very significant equipment problems, right? We already are seeing them forced to use much more dated equipment coming out of storage now, and that's only going to increase as a problem over the course of this year, obviously depending a bit on how the fighting this year goes. But it's clear, if you look at how the Russian military is fighting, how they're prosecuting this war, they are not operating as though they have lots of time and time is on their side and all they must do is wait. Quite on the contrary, they are operating as a force that needs to achieve objectives and is expending manpower and equipment at a high rate to achieve them in a fairly narrow window of time before I think the relative advantages, rather than increasing, begin to slowly close, and the likelihood of achieving those tasks, at least to combat on the ground, decreases. We should make a big caveat of we don't know what will happen with the two countries' respective strike campaigns against our national territory and the effect that they can have on critical infrastructure and what have you, what we've seen taking place over the last 2 months. So we shouldn't just be focused narrowly on the front line and the line of control and what's happening there, but zoom out and look at the war from a strategic picture as well.
Brilliant. Thanks, Mike, for setting the stage for us and sort of foregrounding our conversation in the sort of military realities now and to the best that you can see in the near future. Veronica, can I come to you next? Veronica Anghel is lecturer here at SAIS. She's also an assistant professor at the European University Institute. What it would be really useful to do is reflect on what you take away from all of our discussions, from all the other cases we've discussed in the last day or so, and how you think they apply to Ukraine. And in particular, I'm certainly struck by the number of cases our historians have told us where they think belligerents anticipate. They're quite gloomy on their prospects of fundamentally changing the battlefield by force. Yet for many reasons, some of them quite reasonable and rational ones, they absolutely fight on. I'm wondering if you see any echo of that here, or if you think that that it's a very different case. And also perhaps when we talk about an end in sight, if you could just give us your sense of what end do we mean by this, right? What are the different types of ends, and how should we think about the distinction between a just peace or an unjust peace, to the extent that is relevant to these discussions, which it does seem to me to be?
Thank you, Shashank. We really had a rich conversation for the past 2 days. So there was a lot of food for thought. I'm a political scientist and working on European integration and enlargement. And usually we didn't used to talk this much about war in the last years. And now we're all getting a fast forward degree in war as the European Union has decided to enlarge. So in this conversation, we're all very interested whether the war is going to end or whether we're going to live with it and bring it closer and closer. That is not the same thing. And so these conversations are really very important. Unfortunately, this has been a very gloomy set of remarks that we've ended up our reviews from how I understood them for the last 2 days. There is no end in sight, and the conditions to even push for a sustainable peace are not currently met, and not even less so for a just peace. So I'm going to go through the 5 minutes, 1 minute each, maybe for 5 reasons why there is no end in sight in the Russia-Ukraine war, and bring it down to why just peace is really actually quite far away in the future. So first of all, there is no vision of a post-war world order. This is the first reason why there is no end in sight. Second, Russia and Ukraine have set themselves very high goals for how victory looks like, and these goals are not at all compatible. Third, the states and leaders, as we've learned, are very responsive to public opinion, and public opinion now on both sides, in Ukraine and in Russia, seem to want the war to continue, or at least they don't want it to stop in the stalemate that they are perceiving right now. Fourth, there's a very important conversation about the post-war narrative of success, and that is also not something that is being developed currently. And not least, so the fifth reason lies in what I see, and this is where my work comes into play, the inconsistency of support for Ukraine. And we have seen how important this has been in how the collective West, let's say, has acted in other wars as well. So just to briefly go over these, what do I mean by, what do we mean by there's no vision of a post-war world order? I can't see any understanding of how that world order looks like. How does Europe look without Russia, or increasingly isolated Russia? What are we going to do with Russia, right? How will Russia accept any kind of world order? This is a collective action problem. Are we able to put together multiple interests at once and provide a structured world view. That same question just has to be answered from the perspective of China, right? How does China fit this world order? It's the same China that apparently, is participating to bleed the West dry of resources. That also matters. And I would even go as far as to say that there is no agreement or no acknowledgement currently of the disorder that Russia has created through this full-scale invasion. Not everybody agrees that this is a big deal. And I think that's most distressing. And it's a very complicated problem because this invasion has complicated transatlantic vital geopolitical interests, and when we cannot agree on what to do next. I'll go to my second point. Russia and Ukraine have high goals for how victory looks like, and these are very incompatible. And there's a very important book that Maria Popova and Oksana Shevel have published recently, and exactly on how divergent the paths of state building have been for Ukraine and Russia, and how these are not at all able to work. And Putin came for the sovereignty of Ukraine, not for Avdiivka. And so that will continue to be a goal. And we see this also in how we've seen just recent reporting by Elena Rybakova in DFT of direct military spending in Russia that has tripled. We have 6,000 military enterprises that are working around the clock in 3 shifts. I have this visual since I've read that article, and they're just churning out more equipment. So even if, like Mike said, this may not last, it doesn't matter on the field and so on, the impression is that they're committed. So there's no steps that are being prepared to take back. And this really is a major problem. The third point about states and leaders that are responsive to public opinion, obviously, I cannot speak for Ukraine, none of us can, but the Ukrainians are speaking very loudly for themselves, and they are committed to their country's sovereignty. And we also have polls coming out of Ukraine all the time, where we see like 88% of Ukrainians right now believe in a victory at the level of the population. And you cannot be indifferent to that. You cannot go into any kind of negotiations that will provide any other kind of outcome. 50% believe Ukraine's borders should return to 1991 borders. So Ukrainians do not want a peace that is unfinished, and that is important to take into account and why this war is not going to stop. Both sides have glorified this war in different ways, and this gets me to my fourth point about the importance of this post-war narrative. For post-war success, the war has to end in people's minds. This we've learned from multiple cases that we've looked at. And if the war does not end in people's minds, there's no amount of paperwork that you can sign and agree on to have any kind of stable peace, let alone a just one that allows you to continue in a way that you can get reparations and get your land back and your sovereignty maintained. So this is a lot of instability that will derive from broken promises. Unfortunately, the European Union, and this is why I'm getting to my fifth point, is a master at broken promises, diplomacy as well, and this is very important because the inconsistency of Ukraine's supporters will only grow. We have elections coming up in Europe in June, and we will see that the European Parliament will have more Russia-friendly parties, or at best Ukraine-neutral. This will challenge European Union enlargement. It will raise more obstacles to funding provided for Ukraine, and if there is no end in sight, then funding is even more and more important. And I think we should get back to this topic later on about the role of supporters for Ukraine that have an impression of themselves that they've done a lot, but there is a huge gap between the reality of investment in Ukraine and the expectations.
Veronica, thanks very much for that. You raised a point about the war ending in people's minds and the importance of that. And on that note, I want to go to Keith Gessen. Keith is a journalist, a very distinguished journalist, and also assistant professor of journalism at Columbia University. Keith, I understand you might have some prepared comments, but I also actually really would like you to pick some of that up, because I wanted to ask you, what do you think it would take for the war to end in Russia's or the Kremlin's mind? Whether you think we have a way of answering that question, and even if that is, a more modest question might be, what do you think it would take to change the Kremlin's objectives in this war? It seems we don't have very clear answers to that, and the answer we had at the beginning of 2023, which was a successful offensive to take back territory, to shock the Kremlin into seeing that it could lose territory, it could be on the back foot if the war continued. That pathway to changing the Kremlin's mind, we seem to have had our confidence shaken in that. So are there other pathways that you foresee? I'd love to hear your views on that. And again, if you could stick to 5 minutes, it would be great.
Sure. Thank you. And I'm really honored to be part of this panel. And I'm very sad not to be there in person. Yeah, a few thoughts. I think one thing that I keep coming back to in my mind vis-a-vis Kremlin intentions, I think a lot of people have gotten egg on their face in the last few years trying to guess what Putin is thinking or is it going to do. But I went to Moscow in January of 22, in late January, and by then people in DC had been kind of raising the alarm, and as we now know, they had very good intelligence about Russian intentions. They'd been raising the alarm in the fall of 21, Mike among them, and saying that an invasion was imminent. So I thought I'd go to Moscow and see what people were saying there. And the really striking thing was that nobody in Moscow thought that it was going to happen. Just nobody. And I found that, and I wanted to write. I came back and I wrote an article saying no one in Russia thinks there's going to be an invasion, which nobody wanted to publish because it wasn't very interesting. And it became interesting in retrospect, at least to me, because it showed two things to me. One was Putin didn't tell anybody about his intentions. We now know that. He didn't tell his military. And so the kind of information that was circulating in the kind of bloodstream of Moscow conversation, even among people who were relatively well informed, it hadn't entered that kind of bloodstream because he kept it really close. So that's interesting. And the other thing, that I found interesting in retrospect is just there was nobody who thought this was a good idea. People thought it was just outlandish. Why would Putin do this? It made no sense to people in Moscow. So the elites were totally taken aback by this whole thing. So in terms of kind of thinking about Putin's intentions and the Kremlin's intentions, when there is no kind of social demand for something, it makes it very hard to figure out what the levers are, what the factors would be, that would cause Putin to change his mind. One of the things that I learned when I was writing about war termination and talking to some of the people who were at this conference, the way that they put together the sort of data sets, right? When you write an article or a book, more typically about war termination, you use one of the big data sets about all the wars that have taken place, and then you go through and you kind of code it for the things that you need to find out about those wars. So, for example, if you're talking about what kind of regime is going to, stay in a war longer than is reasonable, well, that's a kind of hybrid regime, right? Whereas a fully dictatorial regime, according to kind of war termination theory, can sell a peace to its people, whether or not it's a good peace. And so one of the things that struck me about that kind of work of coding is that it's subjective, right? So what kind of regime is the Putin regime? Is it, as it seems to a lot of people, a fully dictatorial regime that can sell any sort of peace to the Russian population? Or is it a regime that is still what we used to call a hybrid regime, that in fact is still subject to popular pressures, is now going to be reacting to a kind of demand for the war that wasn't there, before the war, but that it has itself created through its propaganda. They still haven't, as Mike has said many times, they still haven't done a second mobilization. They don't want to, right? Which suggests it's not, Saddam Hussein's regime in Iraq. So this is a way of kind of saying, I have no idea, Shashank. And I think, it does feel like an isolated person in the Kremlin, whose intentions are very hard to judge.
Keith, thank you for that, and thanks for honesty. Although I hope we in the course of this discussion drill slightly closer to that question. It seems to me that one of the many factors in the Kremlin's calculation is that they recognize the paramount importance of external support to Ukraine's ability to keep itself financially solvent, but also on the battlefield militarily equipped. And that one of their judgments is that external support will fragment over time in various ways. And events in the US Congress may have given them some succor in that regard. Veronica, you talked about European elections and the ascendancy of more Russia-friendly parties. And so with that in mind, Hal, can I turn to you to ask both how you see the importance of this supplemental, but also if this is, as many fear or anticipate, the last big US supplemental, what will and what should happen after that as regards Ukraine's external partners? And Hal, of course, Hal Brands is a professor at SAIS in Washington.
Yeah, so I think the $61 billion will buy you the ability to dramatically reduce the risk that Ukraine loses the war in some way or another this year, because that was always as much of a psychological and a political problem as a military one. You don't have to imagine a scenario in which Russian tanks would roll into the capital or anything like that to imagine a scenario in which Ukrainian forces just run out of ammunition, they run low on manpower, they suffer some important defeats along the front lines, and that creates a political crisis of confidence in Ukraine because there's no path to victory or an acceptable outcome of the war, and that starts to force some pretty hard decisions on Ukrainian leaders. Notwithstanding the points that Mike made, with which I wholly agree, that Ukraine has some very difficult months ahead and may lose more territory in the months ahead, you're much less likely to have that happen now, just because you're much less likely to have Ukrainian forces run out of shells and things like that. So that's good. So that probably gets you through 2024 and into 2025. The challenge is that I don't know that the supplemental buys you a workable theory of war termination. And so you mentioned, Shashank, I mean, I think you captured it very nicely. Sort of the 2023 version of the theory of war termination was, you do this counteroffensive, maybe you don't make it all the way down to the coastline, but you find ways of cutting into the Russian presence in southern Ukraine, putting Crimea at risk, and thereby forcing Putin to negotiate some sort of peace that Ukraine and the West could live with. I think that was always problematic, and when you asked people in Washington whether they really believed that Putin would negotiate at that point, you got a lot of mumbo jumbo. But it's sort of a moot point because it didn't work, right? And so now what's your theory of war termination? And so I think what you have, the new theory, at least as I've heard it expressed, is Ukraine defends effectively in 2024. You buy time for some of the limitations in the Russian war effort, which Mike talked about, to kick in. You hope that 2025 is better, and you hope that Ukraine can develop a credible offensive capability, whether or not they use it, that provides them with some leverage to negotiate a peace. So first, note how the goalposts have moved, right? We are not talking about a Ukraine that liberates all of its territory or all of its territory, save Crimea. We're probably talking about a Ukraine that negotiates a peace kind of along the current line of contact or something close to that in this scenario. So it's a much less ambitious peace from a Ukrainian perspective or a Western perspective than was the case even a year or so ago. Second, I mean, I think there are real questions about whether you can actually make that theory work, right? And so, yes, Russia is operating under certain constraints that may become sharper over time, but if Russia is able to gain additional ground over the remainder of this year, that's presumably going to increase expectations in Moscow about what the end of the war will look like. There are huge questions around the sustainability of Western aid, particularly U.S. aid for Ukraine after this. I don't think the assumption in Moscow is that this is the first of many $61 billion aid infusions from Washington. I think the assumption would have to be this might be the last big aid infusion from Washington. And of course, we have an election in November, and so who knows what U.S. policy will look like come January. And so I think what this tranche has done, and I'll end here, is it has convinced Putin that he's not going to win the war by default this year. It has not convinced him that he won't simply outlast Ukraine and the West over time.
I just want to pick up on one thing you said, which is this question of the fall in the level of ambition, right? And the language used by Western leaders, as long as it takes, had inherent ambiguity. Was it as long as it takes for full territorial restitution, or was it as long as it takes to negotiate a peace acceptable to Ukrainians, or something else? And that ambivalence, I think, has been exploited, and indeed it means something closer to the latter now, as long as it takes to negotiate some sort of peace. But Veronica, I just want to come back to something you said, because Hal has talked about the fall in ambition, the recognition, and that it's going to be formidably difficult to restore 1991 borders, let alone something even short of that. And yet you pointed out our figure of 88% of Ukrainians believe in victory and seek victory. And Ukraine is a democracy. It's a democracy where the leadership also has to be responsive to public demands as well as other factors. But how do you bridge this gap? How do we bridge this problem? Is it in the artful construction of a settlement in which Ukraine may gain something else, even if the level of territorial ambition changes, which could include security guarantees or something else, or a closer relationship with the European Union, something that you work on? Or is it, in fact, more likely that the Ukrainian leadership believes that it is in their interest not to forsake that 88% of Ukrainians and to fight on and take their chances, even if that rests on what Hal a few times called a hope, not any certainty or great confidence?
So it was really interesting to hear from Hal that the strategy going forward is, you said hope at least 2 or 3 times there, so not great. So I think that it's exactly this absence of ambition that is programmatic in itself, and it also shows just a bit of a lack of understanding of Ukrainian mindset that is being transferred to us, or just some kind of wishful thinking that there's a status quo that you can go back to, as if this invasion was not such a big deal, and it is a very big deal. That the whole security architecture of the European Union is being challenged. The European Union is very slow to understand the extent of the problem, and it's moving slowly because that's what the European Union does. This is how it works. It's a whole slow process of transformation. So even the fact that they've opened the enlargement negotiations with Ukraine and with Moldova, and that they have shown the signs to include these countries more and more, was a big deal for Europe. But it's not enough, and all of these processes are also reversible. So this closer relationship with European Union is not going to look like black and white, in or out. The European Union is going to get closer and closer to Ukraine, integrate Ukraine in the single market. We already have 4.2 million Ukrainians in Europe working. Whether they're going to go back to Ukraine is really, really a question, as they're going to participate in post-war recovery. And the European Union is starting to invest as well in Ukraine's post-war recovery. The problem, and in its own defense systems, slowly again, the problem is that it will not move fast enough to make a difference on the battlefield. And that is not something that the European Union is prepared to do right now. So it's doing it through this extending of enlargement. On the other side, like you've mentioned, Ukraine particularly has to make all these reforms, which is very challenging even in peacetime, let alone how do you build rule of law or strengthen your rule of law while you're under martial law? These are opposite things, right? So it's an experiment that we are looking at as Europeanists, as people living in Europe who want to support Ukraine's European and democratic path. And want to create that closer connection that you've mentioned that also answers the desires of Ukrainians. It's a very different challenge from anything that Europe has done before. Europe has been here in the past. They've responded to the pressure to enlarge before to Central and Eastern Europe under conditions of war in Yugoslavia. We talked about that today as well. But this is the scale of the challenge right now is just incredible. And I'll just finish with one point, going back to the transatlantic relationship. You would have thought that if Russia gets on the go, right, again, the United States and Europe would have found their overarching purpose to get closer. But we see that the transatlantic relationship, even under these conditions, has structural problems that go beyond the ad hoc needs to answer to a more increasingly belligerent Russia. And there is I don't know what the Europeans are hoarding all their military equipment for and not transferring it to Ukraine. What other enemy are they preparing for?
Well, I just to briefly come in on that, I do think that we've seen in the last several months heightened concerns, particularly among Northern Europeans, about the speed of Russian rearmament, exceeding early intelligence estimates as to how fast that's been accomplished. A Russia that is spending upwards of 6% of its GDP on defense, maybe 45% of its government spending on defense and security. And I suspect one fear is that should the war conclude in some fashion, or indeed should Russia and Ukraine not be able to stabilize the lines, which is not a given at this stage, as Mike outlined, that there are concerns about an Article 5 scenario, Europe, NATO members being challenged, and that that is an additional complication in the question of how much of stocks, which were already run down quite dramatically in 2022, can be given away further. But we can come back. Before I want to open it up in just a minute, but I do want to I think we can't continue without raising the question of security guarantees. I think we have to address that. We've talked about a little bit about what it might take for Russia to change its mind or to revise its expectations about this conflict. And we can, any other comments on that we'll happily take. But on the Ukrainian side, it seems one of the problems here is a sort of commitment problem. They don't necessarily believe, with some justification, that Russia will abide by the terms of any settlement. And that's grounded in history, given the last 10 years of the Russia-Ukraine conflict and the Minsk agreements. And I think that one factor that will make Ukraine more likely to accept difficult settlements, and I'm not endorsing these settlements right now, one way or the other, is whether if it knows it has robust security guarantees from the West. Yet it looks like NATO guarantees, NATO membership is relatively unlikely at this time. So I'm curious if any of the panelists would like to come in on how they see that issue evolving, whether there is a way of bridging the gap between the rather tepid bilateral security arrangements being negotiated at present and Ukraine's hope for a strong, robust Article 5 type guarantee that would foreclose the door to a renewed Russian invasion in the future and might make it easier to accept a settlement. Yeah.
I have a quick point to that, and it connects to European Union enlargement. So part of the European Union treaties is that there is a mutual defense clause. Article 42.7, if one member gets attacked, then everybody responds. It's much stronger than Article 5, where you can respond according to what you consider necessary. But the problem is that we don't have the credibility to back that up with force projection and deterrence. So the moment in which you extend the membership to Ukraine, that would be great security guarantee, but it's got to come with a huge investment in your defense complex system. So maybe this is a start.
I'll just say a couple. I mean, there were kind of two models of security guarantees that were being discussed in Washington when this was really hot last year around the time of the NATO summit. And one was, the NATO model where you bring Ukraine into NATO. That appears to be mostly a non-starter for the Biden administration. Just doesn't seem to be something that the president wants to do. If you get a Trump administration, probably not dramatically greater odds it happens under Trump, unless you can somehow sell it to him as part of the best peace deal ever that he brings to Ukraine, and so maybe not outside the realm of possibility. The challenge, though, is that the second model, which was the Israel model, right? And so this was a long-term sort of memorandum of understanding agreement between the U.S. And Ukraine, maybe some other countries, outlining long-term military supply commitments and things like that. That looks a lot less credible now because the politics of providing billions of dollars a year in support to Ukraine have become so much more complicated in the U.S. than they were even a year ago. And so you might still be able to get to that type of model, frankly, if you can get the Europeans to do a lot of the heavy financial lifting. But I think that's probably what it would take in the U.S. The one other arrangement that's sometimes been talked about, which is maybe...
Can I think you'd also just want to call it something else than the Israel model, if you were going to, I think, sorry.
You're not convinced by the marketing approach to that one?
Yes, I think if you were going to use that model, you'd have to give it a new name in the current. Mhm.
Okay, thank you. The other approach that has been mooted is some sort of approach that is less than sort of a full-on alliance commitment, but it comes with a thicker presence of trainers, advisors, and foreign military personnel who are on Ukrainian soil in this peacetime scenario, sort of creating an implicit deterrent to Russian aggression because you run the risk of running into, British or French or American forces or something like that. Also politically challenging, but probably a little bit less challenging than the NATO model or the Israel model right now.
Okay, thank you. There's a lot of expertise here on the floor from historians, political scientists, others who work on these issues. We even have uniformed military officers here in the front row. And I welcome the view of anyone who wants to chip in on these questions or ask a question to our panelists. Also, I think if you're in the webinar, you can ask questions on the chat function. I can see them. I will very happily put them to the panel. I might take them in groups. But if you could identify yourself, say who you are, where you're from, and make sure that you wait for a microphone before you ask a question, that would be great, so that our virtual panel can hear you as well. Anyone? At the back over there.
Hi, my name is Robert. I'm a first-year Master of Arts in International Relations candidate. I'm going to DC for my second year. And I have a question mostly for Professor Anghel with regards to the European Union and NATO and their commitments to Ukraine. Obviously, it's in the region and there's definitely interest vis-a-vis protecting Ukraine and supporting Ukraine. But Ukraine is not a member of the European Union. The EU, while it's most definitely in their interest to ensure that Ukraine is defended and protected and has the capability, the EU also has other challenges. It has to deal with economic competitiveness, dealing with climate change. Is the EU prepared, do you think, to deal with the Article 42 guarantees that it would have to if it accepted Ukraine? And should we focus more maybe on member states? Maybe this is, I know there's been no attention, but for example, France, if you look at the level of financial support Macron has given to Ukraine, it's quite low. Maybe it's something that we should focus more on member states and their contribution rather than Brussels. Thanks.
Veronica, please go ahead.
So, commitment to Ukraine, first of all, there is commitment to Ukraine outside membership. And this has been seen in a number of ways. There's a Ukraine facility that has been built. That's a 50 billion macro structural funding that will go to Ukraine in the next multi-annual financial framework. That is loans and grants. There's a commitment to Ukrainians who are already in the European Union to support them. There's a commitment to Ukrainians in the sense of, well, there's a lot of conversation in Brussels about EU reform. It's very slow. It's just the way the European Union works, but it's going at greater speed than we're used to. And so there is a sense of growing urgency, and that growing urgency also comes from internal struggles in the European Union to maintain a line of commitment to the challenges that are coming from places like Ukraine. Now, this understanding of how to build security is, for the European Union, has always been problematic. What we see now, or what I see now, is a growing awareness that the European Union has neither deterrence structures and nor force projection in case an attack happens. So you need these two things to make sure that you are an independent power of some sort. So these geopolitical ambitions that the European Union is setting for itself have to be also a lot of walk, not just talk. So in that sense, the European Union right now is not prepared. It's trying to get there, and it's in everybody's interest to move at greater speed.
And can I just follow up on that before I turn back, which is just, Mike, to come back to you to ask a military-focused question along the lines of what Europe can do for Ukraine in the longer run. Is it folly to think that this can be done without the United States, particularly given questions like the nuclear umbrella and other kinds of sort of overarching protection? Or is there a plausible, if not EU, guarantee, one that rests more on a coalition of states, France, Germany, Britain, alongside the Baltics, the Poles, and others? Are these militarily up to this task, or is that outlandish in your view?
So this is going to be one person's perspective from Washington, D.C. I think it would be great if that was possible. And I think it's great to hear European colleagues talk about their aspirations to have this autonomous capability. My current answer is no, and I don't see that foreseeably on the horizon. I see few states that are capable of any kind of military operations at scale without the United States as the lead provider of enablers of integration, what have you. I mean, the bottom line is, while European states are capable of some things, these militaries have evolved, and this is not as much a bug as it has been a feature over the course of the history of NATO, to be complementary and to work and fight alongside the United States military, particularly when it comes to providing security on the European continent, right? And so today, it is still very difficult to see European militaries adding up to the capacity to conduct any sort of military operation at scale without the United States, to organize or coordinate, lead it. And with respect to the EU, it's, of course, a very impressive political economic community, but actually in the run-up to the war, the EU almost functionally disappeared in terms of relevance, as best one could see. And while it is quite relevant economically, and European countries have contributed significantly in terms of equipment and financing, much of the effort is coordinated, run by the United States, organized logistically by the United States. And I really shudder to think what the Western response would have looked like to the war, to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, had you taken the United States out of the picture, based on what I've observed over the last 2.5 years. The question is, can I change and improve and what have you? Yes. And I think Europeans over years have gotten the message that for the United States, Europe, from a strategy perspective, Hal's welcome to chime in on us, is a secondary theater, right? Our primary focus is Indo-Pacific, and this is a secular trend. This is a structural shift in U.S. strategy. It's going to be that way for quite some time. Obviously, it doesn't mean we're going to reduce our commitment to Europe, but it's clear that we are increasingly looking more to Europeans to be able to handle, if not handle security, at least resource, right, deterrence, defense in Europe. And that is going to be still a challenge, given what one can see in terms of trajectory of Russian reconstitution, rearmament on the relative timelines that they're going on. Okay, I hope I answered some of it, but this is my current view. The honest answer is no. And I don't know if security guarantees from European countries to fight or provide military assistance independent of the United States are really necessarily what Ukraine is looking for either, to be perfectly honest.
Can I come in on this for a second? Yeah, so I think this is exactly right. And I would add one other piece of this, or two other pieces. So one is that the challenge is that if you want to have a group of countries that can offer meaningful security guarantees to Ukraine, they have to be countries that can come up with an expeditionary capability, and they got to be able to do that without leaving their own territory vulnerable. And the problem is that the countries that are most interested in providing security assurances to Ukraine are the ones who would be territorially at risk in a conflict with Russia, the Baltic states, some of the Nordic states, and so on and so forth, Poland, right? And so what's made the US so unique is that it's got all of this expeditionary capability, and its homeland is invulnerable to conventional attack. And so you don't have to keep the US military at home during wartime to protect against attacks. There's no European state I can think of, or group of states that can really make that happen. The other thing I would just point out is I don't even know that people have fully come to grips with what a wrenching political and social change it would be for European countries to develop the ability to project lots of military power into Ukraine or elsewhere on the Eastern Front without the United States. I mean, we're talking about a scenario in which you're having to double or triple defense spending in some countries, and you're having to do so in a fiscal context that's probably more restrictive than it is in the US, where we apparently can run deficits indefinitely. And so you're talking about huge increases in taxes or big cuts to social programs which have underpinned the social contract in so many European countries for a long time. That is an agonizing political dilemma to have to face, and I'm not sure that a lot of European countries are there yet.
Mike, you wanted to add something very briefly?
Yeah, just the one thing or to what Hal said. I think folks really need to think about the actual physics of it, of the logistics required, and the fact that much of this historically has really been provided by the United States. And to be clear, it's not that European countries without the US cannot significantly improve Ukraine's military capability. They have been doing that throughout this war. Intelligence, provision of capabilities, having people involved, what have you. But that's not what's being discussed, right? What's being discussed is the actual ability of European militaries, independent of the United States, projecting military power, not even far abroad, but even within the continent. And for many of those countries, it would be a difficult road. Plus, the military transformation that someone would have to go through, like Germany, would potentially have interesting political implications in Europe, right? And some of them have probably avoided acquiring that sort of level of readiness and capabilities as a feature of their strategy rather than a bug, or at least that might be the way they look at it.
Thank you. I promise I'm going to go to the floor in just 1 second, but I did just want to go to the Q&A here I have in front of me. Keith, I'm going to come to you on this in a moment. And the question from Nader is, what is the motivation for Russia's security apparatus, the intelligence services, military leadership to support the war? Doesn't it create more risks and uncertainty? And I think that's interesting because you talked about there being no obvious social demand for the war, and therefore hard to see levers that would change it. If we think instead of social demand about elite views of the war inside the regime as a whole, which includes the security apparatus, views in the military, views in the intelligence services. Obviously, the war has already caused significant ructions in some ways. We saw the march on Moscow, Prigozhin's revolt. That does seem to have stabilized. There appear to be no obvious signs of kind of severe internal fractures at this stage. The generals and ministers who bungled the first stage of the war still remain in office, although with Putin's inauguration today, we could expect to see some changes in personnel. And I just wondered if you think that there is any indication of that kind of internal security apparatus showing signs of fissure, uncertainty, hesitation, when faced with the scenarios that we've just heard about a war in which the defense industrial superiority may wane next year, in which we could see the Biden administration re-elected, things could look worse for them. And how does that internal regime and securocrat perspective look?
Yeah, I'd be curious to know what Mike thinks about this. I'll say a couple of things. I mean, one is I think Putin has been pretty effective at consolidating or at least putting the elites in a place where they have nowhere else to go. That Security Council meeting a few days before the invasion, we kind of saw it in public. All those guys were forced to just kind of publicly sign on to the invasion. I think that was quite effective. I did a piece about this about a year ago, and one of my people I talked to was Peter Clement from a longtime Russia analyst at the CIA, and he said something similar to what Mike just said about the physics of it. He's like, well, who exactly, like it's nice to kind of dream of a coup against Putin, but who exactly is going to carry this out? Who's going to be the one who walks into the room and says, Mr. President, you're under arrest, right? Who's going to be the one to do that? And I don't know that I see it. Certainly, if you're thinking about, the security structures that would need to be, kind of front and center in a situation like that. Having a wartime situation, having a situation where the defense budget or the national budget is, now directed toward defense, that's actually not the way you alienate the security and military elites. They enjoy that. Right. So, and another thing that was pointed out to me when I was working on that piece was, Khrushchev, who was a recently deposed Russian leader, was incredibly inconsistent. He was always alienating the people close to him. I think Vlad and I, Zubok, who's in the audience, I see the back of his head. We talked about this. Nobody kind of knew when they woke up in the morning. People close to Khrushchev didn't know where they stood, in the Politburo that day, right? And one thing that Putin has not done is actually fire people and he keeps those people close to him, right? So it is not an effective way to prosecute a war. It is not an effective way to run a country. It has so far proved to be an effective way to not be deposed. So I don't see it yet. I don't know, Mike, what do you think?
Briefly.
Yeah, sure. So I think my first view is that personalist authoritarian systems, their job number one is coup-proofing the system. Their job number two is limiting any alternatives. That's one of the many reasons why the Prigozhin mutiny failed, because nobody saw Prigozhin as a viable alternative to the system or somebody who had anything to offer that was better that they were interested in. I think the challenge with making any of these predictions in a personalist authoritarian system is the statistics aren't great. I mean, most leaders in these systems tend to die in power. Sorry, it's not like in the movies, unfortunately. Most coups are stopped at the planning phase. You never hear of them. So it's actually a small percentage of the coups that even make it to some kind of phase where you see a coup attempted in that system. And lastly, because of the nature of the system, the one thing you're sure of is you can never actually predict regime change, because in that system, all elites look very, very loyal until the very last minute. Okay, and then they change, and often it's a person that you tend to appoint as somebody who you think is very loyal to you, who might be the person that actually comes and meets you, when you get off the plane and tells you that your days are over. So the one thing I'm confident of is if there is regime change in that system, it will be driven by elites, and we will not be able to predict those shifts very easily in advance, or we'll probably get wrong.
I'm sure we've all seen that great historically informed documentary, The Death of Stalin. Okay.
It's a great Yanushi film.
To the floor, please. I'll take a few at a time, so just starting there, please, at the front. Sorry, if you could wait for the microphone so our virtual audience can hear you as well.
So, thank you, Holger Afflerbach, University.
I'm not sure that's...
Okay, perfect. My name is Holger Afflerbach. I'm professor at the University of Leeds. I have 4 quick questions or comments. The first one...
Maybe very brief, or pare them down to, 1 or 2.
Of course. The first one, guarantee looks, from a historical perspective, the European guarantee looks ludicrous to me. For example, there was a 1939 guarantee. Britain and France guaranteed Poland. And of course, it led to the Second World War. But Hitler not even believed then that they will stick to the guarantees. For that reason, if I were Ukrainian, I would not believe that any European country would be a good guarantor. Point 1. Point 2, Europe could outsource and outproduces the Russians by far and build an enormous army, but it will not happen. For example, Germany has 180,000 men under weapons and tries desperately to bring it to 205,000 men and is unable to, even despite the fact that we have Zeitenwende and so on. Third point, Ukraine's decision to divide itself is, of course, an independent decision. It is not only dependent on the Europeans or Americans. They make a national decision to fight, and they have also to see how to get along. And the last point, we read occasionally, but quite consistently, about a kind of compromise which probably the Russians and the Ukrainians would hate likewise. And this compromise would be territorial concessions for the Russians, and the rest of Ukraine can do whatever it likes. So both sides would hate that, but how would the panel believe the probability of this kind of compromise?
Okay, I'd like to take a couple more over there in the corner, please.
Hello, I hope you can hear me well. My name is Bernardo Monzani. I'm an actual alumnus, and I also work for an organization that focuses on peace building. My question is actually related to the last point that was made, the idea of a compromise. It seems like the conversation today is very timely, but also very focused on getting the parties to the table, to the negotiating table. And in my experience, that's one big part of ending a war, but then there's everything that happens at the negotiation table. And of course, there's a lot of theories and practices and lessons around what happens around the negotiation table. And I was hoping I could ask you all to say a little bit about what you may think a negotiation would look like, and specifically what kind of issues, non-security issues, would come in that might tilt at the end of the war towards, let's say, one outcome as opposed to others. Thank you.
Sorry, and I'll come back to you, I promise. Sorry, turn my mic on.
I want to talk about of the equilibrium path.
Sorry, could you just introduce yourself for our virtual audience?
My name is Hein Goemans. I study how wars end. Hi, Keith. My question is the equilibrium path outcome. What happens, and what has been thought about in Washington and Europe and elsewhere, if Russia is not punished for its aggression? What is the consequence for the world order in Europe and elsewhere if Russia gets at least 2 additional provinces as a result of this war?
Okay, lots of food for thought there. I wonder, Hal, if I could start with you, because just on world order, since you've written a lot on that subject, if you could perhaps tackle that, and then I'll move on to you, Veronica.
It's not great, but it depends on what happens next, right? And so if Russia, pays a huge blood price to, annex some Ukrainian territory, and that is followed by a major NATO move to shore up the other Eastern Front countries. It's followed by a continued economic campaign to grind Russian potential down over time. It's followed by a bunch of measures to address the insecurity and the destabilizing implications that would have. Then it's tragic for Ukraine, but it's not necessarily a world-changing event. The challenge is that it may happen in a context in which those remedies are less likely. And so if you get something that looks like an ugly Russian victory because the US has dropped out of the coalition supporting Ukraine, then you're also less likely to get the things that I just talked about. The only other thing I'll mention here, because I think it's sometimes overlooked, is if you go to countries in East Asia, Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, they were intensely freaked out about the possibility that the US Congress might not appropriate more aid for Ukraine, in part because they see it as a register of US resolve in general, but also because they are really worried about living in a world where a nuclear-armed power can use nuclear weapons as a shield and then conduct conventional aggression against a non-nuclear weapons state, right? For obvious reasons, that's a really bad world for all three of them. And so when this war concludes, I think one of the challenges is going to be addressing the proliferation pressures that will break out in East Asia as a result of it. They're strongest in South Korea right now.
Thank you. Veronica, can I turn to you, particularly on that? I mean, you tackle whatever you'd like, but I particularly like to hear you also on that question of the compromise and that question of what else is there in that negotiation space. And I'll come to you, Keith, too, on this, but I'm thinking here of issues like financial compensation for damage to Ukraine, seizure of Russian assets to fund those that sort of compensation, issues around long-term justice and accountability for war crimes and issues of abuse, human rights abuse in occupied territory, all these other issues that may not figure in immediately to the security paradigm, but also sit inside that question of what a compromise might look like and what else is on the table.
So before I talk about the compromise, because it's a very uncomfortable position to be in to discuss compromise when the Ukrainians are not at the table. So just thinking that when also to one point to the world order, there are also other questions, not just great power competition, questions that we need to address. What do we do with the views about our post-colonial world? What does this mean to that kind of worldview? Have we learned anything from the fact that the so-called global South did not support the collective West's view of what to do with Russia? What do we do with, are we taking seriously the idea that women's voices are being marginalized in these sort of conversations? So this worldview conversation is not just who gets to be the hegemon, I think, and it's also how do we see a whole restructure of inequality that we might care about. So just that footnote there. And so when it comes to the idea of compromise, for all the reasons that I've started this conversation with, compromise is not possible under current circumstances. And negotiation would just lead to a very unstable outcome because Ukrainians do not want to compromise and because Russia did not come for the territories that it's occupying. Russia came in Ukraine to take over Ukraine's sovereignty. And they will not stop until that happens, unless they're fully defeated in this goal. So that is a problem there. And also, it's important to note that Russia entered Ukraine because they thought nobody cares. Not because we were overinvested in Ukraine. On the contrary, we've been not paying attention to that region in important ways for a very long time. So is there an answer that the West cares? And that is important in these sort of conversations as well. So I don't think that it's time to talk about compromise, and as long as the parties that are supposed to negotiate don't want to have that kind of conversation.
Keith, can I just turn to you on that? And one thing that occurs to me is that we remember from 2022, President Emmanuel Macron arguing publicly that Russia must not be humiliated as part of the process of the war and how it ended. He doesn't say that anymore, and he's dropped a lot of that public talk. But I'm certainly, there was a great deal of pushback, and Sergei Radchenko, who introduced us, you argued at the time that Russia needs to be humiliated in Ukraine to some degree, in some fashion, and that touches on the question of what principles need to come out of this conflict for wider effects. So I'm wondering if you could just offer us your reflections on that.
Yeah, I mean, something that Veronica said earlier in the panel struck me was, about Russia losing the war. Of course, one of the difficulties of the post-Cold War period was that Russia didn't think it had lost the Cold War, right? As Vlad wrote in Collapse, right? I mean, from a certain perspective, it was the Russians that dismantled the Soviet Union. Whereas, of course, the West, and in particular the U.S., thought it had won, but Russia did not think it had lost. And so, thinking in terms of most of this conference has taken place in the middle of the night for me, but I was able to catch the World War I panel where someone pointed out that it was very important for the Germans to recognize that they had lost, something they did not recognize in 1919 and did recognize in 1945. So it would be nice if Russia lost the war and really recognized themselves doing so. If we think about what a victory, short of total victory, would look like for Ukraine, it might be worth thinking about what a loss, short of total loss, would look like for Russia, and whether they would kind of think of it as a loss. And another thing that Veronica said that I think was interesting is the kind of distinction. There's 88% of Ukrainians want victory, 50% want the 91 borders. So that does mean that there are 38% of Ukrainians who define victory as something less than the 91 borders. And that is, and I think that number has moved, which I think is significant. The other thing, and I'm curious to know what Hal thinks about this. When talking to American administration officials, I feel like the U.S. ran this kind of well-known contingency planning exercise before the war, where they got together the different parts of government. They called it the Tiger Team, and they did this kind of amazing planning for the various things that could happen in the case of an invasion, what we would do then, and what the Russians would do, what we would do, and this was kind of something that the U.S. government is very good at, or can be very good at, and I feel like the U.S. government performance in the first, in the lead up to the war, and in the first months of the war, pretty impressive in terms of being kind of a step ahead of Putin. In a lot of ways. Since then, it does feel like the strategic goals have been very vague and muddy. And when you talk to administration officials, they say, well, in 2025, Russia's really going to have some turbulence. It's really going to run into problems. And what they think happens after that, I don't know. And so there's this kind of thing that the U.S. government is very good at, which is kind of this kind of contingency planning, and something it seems not to be very good at, which is thinking more strategically and thinking about what happens to Europe and the world after the war.
Mike, before I come to you, Hal, did you want to say anything in response to that quickly?
Yeah, just briefly. So that effort was led by a friend and former colleague of mine, Alex Bick, who was working at the NSC at that point, and he wrote about it in a chapter for a book that I edited that came out about a month ago. I think there's a couple of things going on here. One is that it is easier to do contingency planning before the war starts than after the war starts, because all the people who did the contingency planning before the war starts are now busy, sort of not fighting the war, but managing the war, America's indirect participation in the war. The second point is that it's hard, I think, for this administration to do a lot of detailed thinking about post-conflict arrangements and things like that, because one, nobody knows how the war will end at this point, and two, nobody knows what the political scene in the United States will look like after November. And so I imagine the Biden administration will do more of that, but that's a hurdle. And the third thing is that one of the reasons I think they left it vague was that everybody understood that there may come a point at which U.S. and Ukrainian preferences diverged when it came to the peace settlement. But there was no point in calling that question publicly before you were in a place where you were going to be able to negotiate any sort of acceptable peace. And there was no point in having the fight with Zelensky at a time when it would simply undermine the cohesion of the coalition that was going to need you to get to whatever destination you needed to go in the first place.
Thank you, Hal. Mike, what would you like to pick up from that long list of thorny questions?
I think my colleagues covered the waterfront pretty well here. I think on issues the negotiation table, I think that there are unfortunately several negotiations that have to take place, and it's clear from a Ukrainian point of view, the principal negotiation they're interested in first is the one regarding security commitments from the United States and other countries, because without it, then what is the meaning and value of any agreement that they could possibly sign with Russia? They understand then in principle, and particularly based on specific experience, going back to 2014, What they're likely signing up for is a rearmament period on the Russian part, which is certain, and very uncertain rearmament period on the European part. And given performance of the last 2 years, a great deal of uncertainty that Europe would help arm Ukraine over the course of whatever the intervening period is, and very likely a renewal of Russian aggression, certainly as long as Putin's in power, right? And so that commitment problem has to be secured by another commitment, which, as we already discussed, is very difficult for the United States to make. Certainly, it wasn't doable as we got into an election year. It will be very interesting to see. It's likely going to come up again after the election, right, as the politics change in the U.S. But Russia is also going to want to hear a lot about sanctions, export controls, and a whole set of agreements dealing with the economic side of the equation as well that we haven't mentioned as much that's going to be there. And various side deals that it will want to make alongside of this other deal, if there is such a thing. I think great question of sort of what if Russia gets away with it? So it depends on what we mean by that. I think Hein asked a very good question. First, I certainly think that a big part of this war wasn't just, about Ukraine or about Putin's views on the country geopolitical space. It was part of a larger bid to renegotiate the post-Cold War settlement, Russia's place in European security, who determines outcomes, security outcomes in Europe, and how, right? In this regard, Russia failed. It mounted a significant challenge. But increasingly, as the war got on, it became more difficult to write the narrative of sort of Russian strategic defeat, especially as the war is not over yet. That looked like a much easier story to tell early in 2022. And than it has been in 2023 and certainly in 2024. I do think that we will have a genuine problem if, however this war ends. First and foremost, we're left with a major power in Europe that is principally a revanchist state, right? Not status quo state, and that the lesson they've learned is that over time, despite the initial blunder and failure in Ukraine, they were able to outlast and exhaust the United States, NATO, other Western countries, who, in terms of potential, have significant advantages in, GDP, industrial capacity, armaments, what have you, right? On paper, if you look at all the countries materially involved in supporting Ukraine, they grossly exceed Russia by pretty much most any parameter that would matter. And that's a very dangerous lesson for a power to learn. And it needs to be paired with a conversation regarding potential Russian rearmament. We don't know how long that would take, whether it's 7 years, 10 years, more than 10 years, what have you. But, and by the way, just in our own profession, 10 years in defense planning terms is a very, very short timeline. Like in some fields, 10 years is a very long time. When it comes to defense planning, defense strategy, 10 years is basically the shortest timeline you do planning on. It's sort of like tomorrow. So when you're in this work, you're already asking about what does European security look like in 2035? What might the Russian military look like in 2035? That's the conversation you're having, or at least I'm involved in much more so than not. And lastly, there's a great deal of work that has to be done still on defense planning in Europe. And part of the reason why is, while we don't know how the war ends, what I do want to say is that there's quite a few countries, particularly those that border Russia, who, although, where we've ended up in this war is certainly much better than anything people thought, including myself, in the run-up to the war. If you look at what we imagine this war is going to go like in January or early February in 2022, this is a much better outcome than expectations, including by military analysts such as myself. But there are plenty of countries in Europe who are part of NATO, who border Russia, that don't see this as what success looks like, okay? And it's not that United States, or I think NATO is particularly, I think, overly concerned that it cannot defeat the Russian military. The how and the details really matter in military planning. And there's plenty of countries in Europe that look at this outcome, don't see it as a success story, and would like serious, probably, revisions to what the United States and other countries can do moving forward. And I think they're very right to be engaging in that conversation. And lastly, we talk about war termination, but what happens in between is really important, right? Since there's a fair chance, and I don't want to add gloom upon gloom, but it's worth noting that how this war ends, and this is why Ukrainians in particular are very much interested in the question of security guarantees, will only ensure a third war, okay? And if Russia is more successful, let's say, in that third war against Ukraine, I'm not predicting there necessarily will be one, but it's a distinct possibility. then the history of what happened in this war and Russian poor military performance in this war may become a lot less relevant. And so in general, it's very important to think through what happens during that peace or maybe no peace, no war period, or whatever follows this war termination conversation, because that is going to be profoundly important both for Ukraine and for European security writ large.
Thank you. We don't have an awful lot of time. We have 10 minutes. I would like to get through the other questions that were here. So the gentleman at the back, please, to start with.
Thank you. My name is Paul. I'm a second-year grad student here, and thank you to the panel and to Professor Radchenko for allowing us to get a glimpse of these very interesting discussions you've had over the past couple of days. Just very quickly, Professor Anghel and Professor Brandt talked about it in the last 10 minutes or so. But how much has it been of a challenge to talk about how the war is going to end, when I think it's fair to say that maybe at a BRICS level, the rest of the world, it's already sort of moved on. Brazil couldn't care less. India doesn't mind being a facilitator for Russian energy and for Russian financial resources. And it's more of ironing out details and terms of settlement. And everyone's looking towards the elections that are going to happen, democratic recession around the world. And so what's the challenge in your mind for the rest of the world and for settling the issue of the war in terms of the rest of the world perspective? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Vlad at the front. It's just coming up behind you.
Okay, very close. Okay. Well, nice to be at, to listen to this fantastic panel, and good to see you, Keith, on the screen. Greetings. I was struck during our discussion how big can be a gap between the recognition of the complete military stalemate and the actual moment when one side or both sides throw in their towels and decide to stop killing each other, fighting. So in this way, the Korean War that we discussed, there was one scenario when one of the two primary participants in the war, namely South Korean leadership, did not want to end it and wanted to continue it. And nevertheless, the Korean armistice did take place because the United States and other powers pushed for it. So in this view, do you think anything can be done to narrow this period between the point when everybody would say it's a military stalemate and the war is unwinnable under any conditions, and the point when one or two sides would finally, the political leaders would decide to stop the slaughter? Thank you.
And finally, John Harper over there, please.
Thank you. Vlad, I would challenge you on that. I think both sides were ready to settle more or less simultaneously in mid-1951. In any case, my question is simply on the question of compromise. If it doesn't end on the basis of compromise, what other basis is it going to end on? I mean, does anyone think that there's going to be a decisive victory by one side or the other?
Thank you. And before I throw it back to the panel, I'd just like to inject a couple of other points from the Q&A electronically. We had a question about Ukraine's manpower issues, Ukraine's recruitment, and whether legislation passed on mobilization will encourage Ukrainian men to return to defend their country, or whether this is potentially going to become a subject of some tension with Ukrainians in Europe and the Ukrainian government. There's a question around civil society in Europe, particularly popular support among Poles, Germans, other Europeans being very high towards Ukrainians, but whether that can be kept up over the long period that we're potentially talking about, particularly if Vlad is correct. Hal, can I start with you? Maybe you could tackle, and we'll treat these as, we only have very little time left, as closing comments as well. But start with that point about the rest of the world, the BRICS perspective. How does that feed into the question of when the two sides may decide to negotiate, or what that process of finding a compromise may eventually look like?
Yeah, sure. So let me just try to answer the questions also that Vlad and John raised, because I think I can do it really quickly. The problem is that the war is not in a stalemate right now. Russia's winning right now. And so as long as Russia is winning and believes that it is winning, you're not going to get that convergence of expectations. And in fact, if the problem with getting a compromise settlement or an armistice was simply the U.S. convincing Ukraine, the war would be over, right? The U.S. would take that deal any day of the week right now, but it's not, and the Russians wouldn't agree to it. On the rest of the world piece, I would also sort of want to hear what Veronica has to say. I don't know, I guess the way in which it connects to war termination is that there are certain things the U.S. could try to do to dramatically increase the economic pressure on Russia. The problem is they would really piss off a lot of other countries around the world, right? And so the U.S. and its Western partners could go from basically trying to redirect Russian energy flows to trying to choke off Russian energy sales, and the way that the U.S. did to Iran back in 2018, 2019, but that would have a really tough impact on India and a variety of other players, and it would dramatically increase the diplomatic costs of the war from the U.S. perspective. I think the U.S. is going to have to make some hard decisions about this at some point, but that is a cost that the U.S. government just really does not want to pay because it understands and has learned to its chagrin that outside of the advanced democracies, there are a lot of developing democracies, there are a lot of non-democracies around the world that just don't see this as their fight.
Veronica.
Very quickly on the BRICS question as a follow-up, there is no alternative that I'm seeing to the liberal world order that the global West imposed on the others. They have very fragmented interests. So other than just not that, I don't see any world order that is being created, just more disorder. That was very quick answer. Civil society in Europe, support is going down. So you can see that where it's been down is still down. Spaces like Bulgaria, Hungary, Slovakia. Then you have this middle ground where it's going down. Germany, Romania. And then you have high support. The Nordic countries, Scandinavians, and the Baltic states. In Italy, it's also going down. So that's a problem. It's not a huge drop, but the trend is downwards, and that is why we're also going to see these parties weaponize the economic concerns that Europeans are having to use to aggrandize themselves. And my last point on the compromise, also since I'm the only woman voice that has been talking here for the last 1 hour and a half, I want to quote another woman, Ukrainian woman, researcher, Yulia Yurchenko, who has an answer to the kind of peace that is being offered to Ukrainians very quickly. She says, peace at any cost is not just a phony peace. For Ukrainians, it means sanctioning genocide of them in occupied territories, erasure of their collective identity, and the diversity of their we understanding by Russia's annihilation by assimilation. For people of the Russian Federation who oppose Putin, it means persecution, torture, and even death. That phony peace demanded is just violence.
Mike.
Okay, so briefly, on stalemate, very much in agreement with how objectively there is one right now. Part of the challenge is that for there to be a stalemate, it has to be recognized by both sides, it has to be durable, and it has to be costly for some period of time. Unfortunately, in any given period of time in the war, military establishment look at the same situation but come up with different conclusions for what it means, and the people who make these decisions at the end of the day are political leaders. And for political leaders, the military balance or what's happening on the battlefield is one of several inputs to them. They have domestic politics to consider. They have all sorts of other things to consider that we should keep in mind that military leaders may not. And so it's not an overly rationalized process or that's clean cut and dry, right? Even if analysts objectively assess it to be a stalemate, which I don't believe it to be, nonetheless, that's not what's important. It's important what the two establishments fighting and what the external parties to the war think it to be, right? I think it's important, at least this year, in the best case scenario, that from the fighting this year, what Russia learns is that they are not able to achieve their objectives to use of force, right? And as we head into next year, that not only are they not likely to improve their position on the battlefield, but that their position may actually worsen, or at the very least, is going to be very costly with very little gain, and that should help start changing the conversation, especially if you're able to reconstitute Ukrainian military power sufficient enough to pose a threat of Russian losses on the battlefield. This is why I opened up by asking the question, does Ukraine necessarily need another offensive, or does it need the proposition of being able to conduct another offensive in order to achieve war termination on favorable terms? On manpower, which is a question specifically asked to me, this is a complex and thorny issue in a very short amount of time. What I'll say is Ukraine passed the mobilization laws. They go into effect this month. It will take quite a few months to resolve this issue. Manpower, unlike ammunition, will take quite a few months to actually address. Ukraine has the men, right? It's not an issue that the country's out of men. It's also not even so much an issue that men, at least from my point of view in Ukraine, don't want to fight. It's a question of conditions, under what terms, will they be trained, will they be equipped, and the law addresses not all of this, but at least it addresses both the benefits, the concerns, and whatnot. Here's the big issue. The issue is the process. Ukraine will need significant Western help in order to substantially increase the men that it is able to mobilize and then train and equip. People, as you imagine them on paper, are not just convertible into combat power. This is why whenever folks kind of just look at Russia and Ukraine and say, well, Russia has 4 times the population than Ukraine. Yeah, okay, that's true. But that doesn't mean that Russia can just take these people, train them and equip them and field them into units, or it may do that, but at a rate not sufficient enough to establish a decisive advantage. It's very important to understand military analysis, not just basic algebra, where if one side has 4 times more people than the other, then by definition it's already dramatically superior on the battlefield. If it was, you would have seen very different Russian performance in this war over the last 2 years, right? So the manpower issue, I think, is the essential issue for Ukraine this year. And one thing we have to see is not only can Ukraine stabilize the front, but can it stabilize the manpower situation, put it on a sustainable footing. And very, very briefly on...
I need to wrap you up, sorry. Unless it's one sentence.
It's one sentence. So the question on the world, to me the main concern isn't the world doesn't care. The main concern is the world doesn't wait for you to focus your efforts on the war. Since we have had the Israel-Hamas war, right, this now consumes bandwidth and now consumes effort. If that war escalates and widens, people have to keep in mind that one of the challenges we deal with, people in charge have the same 24 hours in the day everybody else does, right? So one thing we don't know is what world will we be living in 6 months or 12 months from now. It's not a question of them caring, it's that the rest of the planet is not necessarily going to wait for us to achieve war termination in this war, as you already see that playing out. And that's a big unknown X factor.
Thank you, Mike. We're at time, but so sorry, Keith, if you could be reasonably brief. I don't want to hold people up too long, but please, over to you.
Oh, sure. Just very briefly, I'm struck that we're all kind of still stuck between what we want to see happen and what we assess is actually likely to happen. And it's, and what the best kind of options are within what we actually think might happen. So I think that's a very tough kind of thing to square. The other thing, one of the kind of X factors in the war termination stuff was the uncertainty or the hope for more and more U.S. Western, but especially U.S. support. And the U.S. government was always at pains to, they said, we keep trying to explain to the Ukrainians we're not Amazon.com, and this can't go on forever. I will say that the kind of holdup of the supplemental bill was a kind of eloquent demonstration of the fact that while we are a very large and generous and wealthy power, we are an unreliable one. So I do think that might at least help temper expectations or something. Anyway, it's been really nice to be on this panel.
Wonderful. I won't attempt to sum up that very rich discussion, very varied, but I'll just ask you to please thank the panelists for their excellent contributions. Thank you all.